I'd like to introduce Dr. Juan Uriagareca, who will be introducing Dr. Chomsky.
Come in. Yeah, sure, come in. Good afternoon, everybody. Since we took so long to organize, this is a self-organizing crowd, a promise that a better society is possible, I will just cut to the chase. Rapidly, there will be a talk on March 1st by David Simon, creator of The Wire, another one of these conversations. Angela Davis will be here on April 18, 5:30 as well. Actually, she will be in this room, and David will be in Gilderhorn Recital. The format of today's talk, Noam will give his talk, and then there will be microphones in the middle, so try to line up, etc. Norbert, this guy over here, big guy, is going to sit here, and they'll chat, and you will get your chance. So I could tell you a million different things, but look, if you are in this place and you don't know who Noam Chomsky is, you're not just in the wrong talk, you're in the wrong planet. So let's just go directly to him. To me, he's a dear friend, dear mentor, inspiration beyond belief. So welcome, Noam. It's all yours.
Thank you. I've been asked to offer some personal reflections about several notions, grammar, mind, and body. And being obedient by nature, I'd like to comply, and I'll try to do so, but it's not easy. One reason is that I'm skeptical about the status of all three of these concepts, at least as they're conventionally understood. So I'll try to explain why, and then go on to say a few things about how I think they can be usefully reconstructed. So take the first, grammar. I'll keep here to common and traditional usage. A grammar, a descriptive grammar, is supposed to be an account of a language, or maybe a text that you can use to learn the language. Grammars of that kind go back to classical antiquity, and they contain a good deal of information and a lot of insight. But they can't come close to being actual accounts of a language for a very simple reason. Nowhere near enough is understood. For the same reason, a theory of any other complex system, say the visual system or insect navigation or whatever you want, is bound to be incomplete. To understand the nature and the workings of such systems is always a very hard scientific problem, very far from being resolved. It's interesting that it's often assumed to be straightforward in the case of language, not in the other cases. So we constantly hear that a strange failure of modern linguistics is that it hasn't provided a complete grammar of any language, complete theory of any language. One doesn't hear claims that modern science has failed because it hasn't provided a complete account of the mammalian visual system or of the navigation system of bees or something like that, or anywhere near it. And I think there's a reason for the distinction, and it has a long history, in fact. It goes back to a belief, actually dogma might be better, that the workings of the mind have to be transparent. For contemporary philosophy, it's often a definition. Something is in the mind if and only if you can, it's accessible to introspection. Understandable doctrine, but completely untenable. It was thought traditionally, you go back centuries, that the study of psychology and the mind would be much easier than physics, because it's all open to you. All you have to do is look. You know. Well, you can learn a lot about a language from a traditional or a pedagogic grammar, but the reason for that is that you already know the answers to the most fundamental questions. And you know the answers because you're a human being and you have the human language capacity, which enables you to, it's what enabled you to acquire your language in the first place from scattered and complex data, and it can help you use the data more or less organized, maybe presented in something that's called a grammar of the language. It wouldn't be too far from the mark to say that grammars are collections of idiosyncrasies, things you can't know just by being human. So you have to pick them up from data. It's in a rather similar way, if you have, say, a manual for teaching tennis, it won't go into the instructions that you send from your motor cortex to your arm to lift up the racket. And a theory of motor organization is not going to care how you get your ball past the opponent on the first serve. And in general, the scientific theories are almost complementary to the manuals of instruction. They deal with different things. What you don't care about for the manual of instruction is exactly what you do care about for the scientific theory. And something like that is true also with regard to what's called the grammar of a language, and what a linguist interested in the nature of the language, or language generally, would be interested in. So take one other example. There's one of the more interesting discoveries of perceptual psychology not too long ago is Shimon Ullman's rigidity principle. What this means is if a subject is shown several presentations of a few points of light in sequence, what the person sees is a rigid object in motion. The constructed image is just produced reflexively on the basis of inner resources, but the person who sees it hasn't the slightest idea of what they're doing or how or why. And similarly, no grammar of English, what is called a grammar of English, I'm not talking about a scientific grammar now, but what's called a grammar of English, it doesn't even try to account for innumerable, very elementary facts about language. So, just give you a couple of examples to make it concrete. So take the sentence, he wondered if the mechanics fixed the cars. You can ask how many cars and how many mechanics. That's respectively how many cars did he wonder if the mechanics fixed, or how many mechanics did he wonder if fixed the cars? Well, think about those. The first of them expresses appropriately the intended thought, but the second doesn't express the intended thought. There's no problem with the thought, but the language is so constituted that you just can't express it in a simple way. The language design requires you to construct some more complex circumlocution. Well, what are called grammars of English don't deal with matters like that, let alone try to explain them. And for someone who's trying to learn English, that's no problem at all, because they already know the answer. Just as the person who's learning to play tennis doesn't have to be told how to send signals from the motor cortex to the arm, or say to follow the trajectory of a ball. That's part of your nature. Similarly, a person doesn't have to be taught how to perceive a rigid object in motion, even when there's no object and there's no motion. You perceive it anyway, in cases I mentioned. Well, take an even simpler example. So take the very brief sentence, can eagles that fly swim? And ask what it means. It asks whether the eagles can swim. It doesn't ask whether they can fly. Similarly, we can say, are eagles that fly swimming? which means, is it the case that eagles that fly are swimming? But we can't say, are eagles that flying swim? Meaning, is it the case that eagles that are flying swim? Now, again, the thought is fine. It's a fine thought. I just expressed it the proper way. But the language doesn't allow it to be expressed without a complex circumlocution. And again, there's no problem for the person learning English because the human language capacity reflexively yields that result, just as it determines that you see a rigid object in motion. And of course, grammar books don't try to teach you anything like that. They just confuse you if they did. In fact, nobody even noticed it. Well, it's, in fact, if you think about it, the facts are kind of puzzling. In each of these in these sentences, let's say, are eagles that flying, are eagles that fly swimming? Are eagles that swimming fly? The verb at the beginning, the verbal element at the beginning, has to pick up a verb inside the sentence to be associated with. And it doesn't do it the easy way. The computationally easy way would be just pick up the first one. Then you would say, are eagles that flying swim, which could express a fine thought if the language allowed you to say it. And that's computationally simple. You just run through the sequence of words, find the first verb. That's the one you attach it to. But you don't do that. You do something much more complex. You have to determine the structure of the sentence and then find the main verb. And that's a computationally complex task. But that's the way language works. And we would, for the science of language, you'd like to understand why it necessarily works that way. And there's some pretty good reasons. Well, puzzles like that are all over the place. In fact, if you open a book at random, you'll find plenty of them. And language has been studied very productively literally for millennia, back to classical Greece and India. But until the dawn of modern linguistics, about 60 years ago, things like that were never even noticed. And it's not surprising. We know the answers instinctively. So for practical purposes, it's quite unnecessary even to notice the facts or to try to understand how language works, apart from scientific curiosity, that is. And it's much the same as in visual perception and much else. And a further reason is that scientific curiosity is not so easy to arouse. Most of what's happening around us just seems obvious, so you don't seek to explain it. Of course, through the ages, inquiring minds have sought explanations, and we have names for those quests. We call them a religion or myth or magic, or in an more organized and systematic form, we call them science. There was a substantial leap forward in scientific inquiry, particularly from the early 17th century. It's often called the Galilean Revolution. And an important part of that leap, that move forward, was the recognition that things that seemed obvious were in fact very puzzling, like the example that I just mentioned. So for millennia, suppose, for example, that I'm holding a cup in my hand and there's boiling water in it and has a cover. If I take the cover off, the steam goes up, and if I let it go, the cup goes down. So why does the steam go up and the cup go down? Well, there had been an answer for millennia, literally. They're going to their natural place. End of story. Steam goes up, cup goes down. Galileo and others of his period allowed themselves to be puzzled about that. Actually, really the first time. And when they allowed them to be puzzled, they found that it's not obvious. And first of all your intuitions about how it works are just wrong as soon as you begin to investigate it. Well, that willingness to be puzzled is typically a first step towards understanding. If you don't just say, look, it looks obvious, finished, then maybe you get some understanding. Well, efforts to solve the puzzle, the kind that I just mentioned, puzzles about motion, they led to a mode of explanation that was given a name. It was called the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy just meant science, so mechanical science. The mechanical philosophy had a goal. It wanted to dispense with the kind of mysticism of the neo-scholastic science philosophy, forms flitting through the air, sympathies and antipathies, other occult ideas. And it wanted to keep to what is firmly grounded in common sense understanding and intelligible to common sense understanding. There was a conception. The conception was that something is intelligible to us if you can give an account of it in terms of a mechanical construction, where mechanical means the kind of thing that a skilled artisan could construct. And that's what the world is, something that in fact a super skilled artisan did construct. So now we have to give explanations in terms of mechanical constructions that we can provide. All of this was stimulated by the technology at the time. This is a period when there were very complex mechanical clocks being made, or models of duck digesting, or the gardens, the royal gardens, where you could walk through and voices spoke to you and statues stood up and all kind of amazing things happened. In fact, the stimulus of the artifacts of the time is not unlike the stimulus today from what's done by computers. It kind of stimulates the imagination and can lead you astray in both cases. Well, the mechanical philosophy, the mechanical science, provided a criterion of intelligibility. If there's no mechanical explanation, there's no understanding. I'll quote one of the leading Galileo scholars, Peter Montgomery. He says that by adopting the mechanical philosophy and initiating the modern scientific revolution, Galileo had forged a new model of intelligibility for human understanding, with new criteria for coherent explanations of natural phenomena, based on the conception of the world as just an elaborate machine, where, again, machine means something that an artisan can construct. And for Galileo, and in fact other leading figures of the early scientific revolution, a true understanding requires a mechanical model. That's, again, a device that an artisan can construct and we could take apart, so intelligible to us. Galileo tried throughout his life to achieve this goal and mostly failed. He rejected traditional theories of the tides because he said we cannot duplicate them by means of appropriate artificial devices. And at the end of his life, his inability to find mechanical explanations for cohesion, attraction, other simple phenomena, it led Galileo to, quote him, to reject the vain presumption of understanding everything. And even worse, he finally concluded, there is not a single effect in nature such that the most ingenious theorist can arrive at a complete understanding of it, meaning an intelligible account in mechanical terms. Actually, that turned out to be true in a deep sense that he didn't anticipate. Well, scientists didn't give up at that point. The founders of modern science continued to try to seek intelligible explanations. The most famous and important was Descartes. He's thought of as a philosopher. He's primarily a physicist and biologist and so on. He, no distinctions among the sciences in those days. He believed that he had succeeded. In fact, he claimed to provide a mechanical account of all phenomena in nature, almost. He noticed that some aspects of the world remained recalcitrant, in particular human higher mental faculties, what Aristotle long before had called the rational soul. And the facts that, the case that Descartes found most convincing was normal use of language. what's sometimes called the creative aspect of language use. In normal language use, we produce new sentences freely without awareness of any novelty. They are not caused by situations, circumstances, but they're appropriate to circumstances, which is a crucial difference. Not understood, but quite a crucial difference. It goes on indefinitely. There's no limit to it. They're intelligible to others who realize that they could have expressed the same thought themselves. This collection of properties, Descartes argued, correctly in fact, lies beyond mechanism. Now, in the substance philosophy of his day, he then followed normal scientific principles. And here's something that doesn't fall within mechanism, so we need a new principle, kind of a creative principle. And in the substance philosophy, that meant we need new substance. We need what was called a thinking substance, res cogitans, which is alongside the extended substance. Substance is just something that can exist independently of other things. So we have a material substance, extended substance, and then we have a thinking substance. And then the next problem is to find out the properties of the thinking substance, the properties of mind, and to show how it links to the other substance, to the material world. Actually, he explored those topics. Some of it survives, not much, so we don't know exactly what he achieved because he destroyed a lot of it after he learned about the fate of Galileo. He was worried about it. So we don't really know a lot of what he said or thought he said. Well, this imposed a lot of other tasks, incidentally. A very serious problem that arose right at the time was that this was the rising period of empire, and explorers were finding all sorts of strange creatures like orangutans and Native Americans. And it wasn't obvious which of them were humans. And it's an extremely important point because if you're human, you have an immortal soul. And if you're not human, you're a machine. So it's quite significant to determine which of these creatures fall into which category. And there's a great deal of debate and discussion about this. My favorite, well, there is a very good Descartes scholar, late Harry Bracken. He presented some quite interesting arguments that these so-called rationalist assumptions provided a barrier against racism. You couldn't be a rationalist and a racist because you either have a soul or you don't have it. You can't have half a soul. So there's no gradations among humans. There's just a break between humans and machines. Well, given the crucial role that language played in these concerns, there was another crucial question. Do these creatures have a language like ours? And there are a lot of debates about this. Actually, one of my favorites was a suggestion by Louis Racine, son of the playwright. He suggested that he had a proof that apes are really more intelligent than us. And the reason is they don't talk. Because, and there's a reason for that too. They know that if they did talk, we would enslave them. So they keep quiet. More seriously, Descartes' followers, so-called minor Cartesians, devised interesting experiments to try to determine if some other creature has this capacity, has the linguistic skills. These tests, which are kind of interesting, are precursors to what today is called the Turing test, named after one of the great 20th century mathematicians and computer scientists. The Turing test is generally regarded as a test to determine whether a machine can think. Turing himself dismissed the question of whether a machine can think as, in his words, too meaningless to deserve discussion. It's a short paper, 8-page paper he wrote, which is the basis for all of this, and that's one line in it. Unfortunately, nobody paid attention to it, and the failure to pay attention to his conclusion, I think, has led to a huge amount of wasted effort and discussion. But it's enough to point out that the rather similar 17th century precursors were dealing with a much more serious, who gave complicated tests, kind of the Turing test type. They were dealing with a much more serious issue, not just how to apply the word think, but what are the constituents of the world? It's a metaphysical question. What's the world made of? Well, the framework of early modern science did give rise to a significant and meaningful mind-body problem. So the material world could presumably be explained by mechanical science, but there are aspects of the world that could not, like creative aspect of language use. So you have to postulate mind, soul, same thing, alongside of body, and investigate its nature and investigate the interactions of the two systems. This point of view, this kind of picture, it does accord pretty well with our kind of common sense picture of what things are like. And it, of course, has much earlier origins in different terms. The Galilean revolution took the long tradition about these debates and it reconstructed it within a serious scientific framework, at the same time laying the basis for modern science. Well, unfortunately, it didn't last very long. All of this was shattered by the end of the century. Isaac Newton, much to his dismay and disbelief, refuted the mechanical philosophy. That's what his great work was. He showed that nothing falls within its range. That is, there are no machines. There's nothing physical. There's nothing material. Even the most elementary phenomena of nature, the planetary orbits, the motion of the tides, can't be explained in mechanical terms. So to account for the phenomena of the world, it's necessary, he showed, to appeal to what were considered occult forces, the same kinds of mysticism that early modern science tried to expunge, the sympathies, antipathies, and so on. It was necessary to appeal to mysterious forces of attraction, repulsion, and the like, which are literally unintelligible, as intelligibility was understood, and also as intelligibility is understood in terms of our common sense understanding. Newton regarded these conclusions, his own conclusions, as an utter absurdity. So absurd, he said, that no serious scientist could entertain them for a moment. And in fact, he spent the rest of his life trying to find a way around the dilemma. He failed. Many other great scientists of the day and later tried as well, also failed. Finally, the task was just abandoned. It was never solved. It was abandoned. And with the abandonment of the task went the only coherent notions of machine, matter, body, physical, any of that array of concepts. So the standards of intelligibility for science were lowered. Instead of trying to to develop intelligible theories of the world, an intelligible account of the world, the task of early modern science, there's a much more limited goal, namely to develop intelligible theories that we can understand, even if we can't understand what they're about. And that's actually modern science. That's a far different matter from early modern science and a much more limited goal. And I think this should be regarded as a very significant shift in the history of thought. By the time we get to the modern thinkers, people like, say, Bertrand Russell, who knew the sciences very well, the modern sciences, he dismisses the very idea of an intelligible world as his words, an absurdity. And when you read what he writes about this, he constantly places the word intelligible in quotes to highlight the absurdity of the quest. Well, though Newton himself regarded his great conclusions as an absurdity, others understood that they had enormous significance. David Hume described Newton in his History of England as the greatest and rarest genius that ever arose for the ornament and instruction of the species. His greatest achievement was that while he seemed to draw the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, he showed at the same time the imperfections of the mechanical philosophy, and he thereby restored nature's ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. That's a pretty far-reaching claim, and I think an accurate one, but very commonly denied. It's commonly claimed we can understand everything if we just try. It was understood in the 18th century why that can't be true. Well, there were other leading thinkers at the time who reached somewhat similar conclusions, sometimes on different grounds. John Locke, for example, he observed that motion has effects which we can in no way conceive motion able to produce, as Newton, in fact, had demonstrated shortly before. And so he went on, since we remain in incurable ignorance of what we desire to know about matter and its effects, therefore no science of bodies is within our reach, and we can only appeal to the arbitrary determination of that all-wise agent who has made them to be and to operate as they do in a way wholly above our weak understanding to conceive. That's Locke. Well, if you, apart from the kind of resigned invocation of the deity, the conclusions are now commonplace among serious historians of science. So Alexander Poiré, one of the leading modern historians of science and physicist, he pointed out that Newton demonstrated that a purely materialistic pattern of nature is utterly impossible, and a purely materialistic or mechanistic physics is utterly impossible too. Mathematical physics requires the admission into the body of science of incomprehensible and inexplicable facts, facts in quote, imposed upon us by what we observe and discover. Well, what then happens to the mind-body problem? There's a standard contemporary view of this. It was articulated clearly by the influential Oxford philosopher Gilbert Ryle in his famous book 60 years ago called Concept of Mind. If I can add another personal note, that was virtual Bible when I was a grad student in philosophy at the time, Penn and at Harvard. Ryle dismissed the concept of mind as with ridicule. He assured us that modern science had gotten rid of the mystical belief that there is what he called a ghost in the machine, you know, a mind inside the machine, just the machine, no ghost. Well, what had actually happened was almost the opposite. Newton had exorcised the machine. He didn't touch the ghost. He left the ghost intact. So Descartes' work on the mind was untouched and undisturbed by Newton's critique. But his mechanical account of what was considered the physical world, that was demolished. And not just his account, but any possible account, because he showed there is no physical world. So there can't be any improvement, at least as the concept physical, material, collection-related concepts, at least they were understood in early modern science, which is pretty much in accord with intuition. Furthermore, these concepts have not been replaced by new notions, so we're still in the dark about what any of them mean. They're used, so people talk about physical, material, and so on, but they're kind of honorific terms. They refer to whatever we take seriously in our efforts to understand the world, just as we sometimes talk about the real truth, not implying that there's some other kind of truth. It's now often remarked that 20th century physics compels us to accept notions that are hopelessly counterintuitive, curved space-time, quantum entanglement, beginning of time, much more. But the fact is that the fundamental problem goes back much earlier, goes back to the early days of modern science, as was very clearly understood at the time and later forgotten, as the absurdities were just kind of absorbed into our familiar science. Well, as Locke and Hume and others recognized at once, intuition and common sense understanding are not reliable guides, and in fact can lead us completely astray. And furthermore, with the collapse of Cartesian science, that's science as it was understood in the modern period, it came to be understood that in empirical matters, we cannot hope for certainty, only plausibility. So we search for the best account we can find. We know that however well confirmed it is, it may turn out to be wrong. So there are no firm foundations for empirical knowledge, no foundationalism of any kind. That was understood in the 17th century. And since it was so well understood then, I must say I find it a little odd these days to read critiques of foundationalism in contemporary literary theory and cultural studies as if such a position could be upheld. It can't, at least in the empirical world. It's been known for centuries, maybe in mathematics and logic, but even there it's understood that the reach is very limited. Well, with the machine exorcised, no more machine, what is there to say about the ghost? Locke actually had quite a sensible proposal. It's known as Locke's suggestion in the history of philosophy. You simply have to assume that the constituents of the world, whatever they are, have the capacity of thought alongside of other capacities that are unintelligible to common sense understanding, like action at a distance, action without contact. The way Locke put it, back to the theological framework, just as God had added to the world inconceivable properties of motion, he might have superadded to the world a faculty of thinking. This is Locke's idea of thinking matter. It was pursued vigorously through the 18th century. It culminated in a quite sophisticated work by a great chemist-philosopher, Joseph Priestley. He developed in some detail his conclusion, I'll quote him, that properties termed mental reduce somehow to the organical structure of the brain. That a similar conclusion had been stated by Hume and others, later by Darwin, and it's almost inescapable after the collapse of the mechanical philosophy, mechanical science. To restate Locke's conclusion without the theological trappings, explorations of the mental aspects of the world should proceed alongside of exploration of chemical, optical, mechanical, and other aspects of the world. It's only in this sense that the concepts of mind and body and matter remain, as far as I can see. Well, there has been a persistent goal of the general project of the sciences, and you can ask why, but it is a persistent goal to try to unify inquiries into various branches of science to take what has always been the most crucial case, to show how chemistry and physics are related, a problem that goes back centuries. Throughout this whole period, it was taken for granted that this unification of chemistry and physics would have to proceed by reduction of chemistry to physics. That is, by showing that the laws of chemistry can be expressed in purely physical terms, in terms of physics. Well, no way was ever found to do this. And well into the 20th century, that was interpreted as, by the most prominent scientists, as showing that chemistry isn't really a substantive science. It's just a mode of calculation. It provides merely classificatory symbols that summarize the observed course of a reaction. It's quoting a standard contemporary history of chemistry. America's first Nobel Prize winner, the 1920s chemist, he dismissed talk about the real nature of chemical bonds as what he called metaphysical twaddle. They are nothing more than a very crude method of representing certain facts about chemical reactions, a mode of representation only. And the reason is they can't be expressed in terms of physics. In 1927, Bertrand Russell observed, quite correctly, that chemical laws cannot at present be reduced to physical laws. The phrase "at present," because he took for granted that the explanatory gap, as it's called in the philosophical literature, would be overcome as understanding proceeded by reducing chemistry to physics. Well, that belief proved to be incorrect. The chemistry was never reduced to physics. And the reason was that the physics of the day, the 1920s, was wrong. It was soon radically modified by the quantum theoretic revolution. And at that point, a virtually unchanged chemistry was in fact unified with the new physics. But that's not reduction, that's unification, something quite different. If you look at the debates by leading scientists and philosophers about the status of chemistry, as recently as 80 years ago, they're strikingly similar to debates today about the status of mental entities and properties. So some argue commonly that the principles of mind and the entities postulated are modes of representation only and will not be part of science until the crucial explanatory gap is overcome by reducing the theory of mind to the neurosciences. There's a kind of standard slogan, philosophy, psychology, that the mind is just the neurological at a more abstract level. And so we'll get it down to, we can explain it in neurophysiological terms. And today, right now, you read of the thesis of what's called the new biology, that things mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains, though these emergencies are produced by principles that we do not yet understand. I'm quoting distinguished neuroscientist Vernon Mountcastle. He's summarizing the guiding themes of the decade of the brain, the decade that ended the 20th century devoted to the brain, and that's what they finally concluded. Well, the phrase "we do not yet understand," it might well suffer the same fate as Russell's similar comments about chemistry 70 years earlier. Other prominent contemporary scientists and philosophers, quoting, have presented essentially the same thesis as what they call an astonishing hypothesis of the new biology, a radical new idea in the philosophy of mind, the bold assertion that mental phenomena are entirely natural and caused by the neurophysiological activities of the brain, opening the door to novel and promising inquiries and a rejection of Cartesian mind-body dualism and so on. In fact, all of these reiterate in virtually the same words formulations of centuries ago after the traditional mind-body problem became unformulable with the disappearance of the only coherent notion of body, physical, material, and so on. And for example, Joseph Priestley's conclusions in the 18th century, which I quoted before, virtually the same words. Today's repetitions of the conclusions of 2 centuries ago have much less justification. For one thing, because they're repetitions. They're saying the same thing. Another is that their forgotten precursors had a basis for their beliefs, a solid basis. namely Newton's demolition of the mechanical philosophy. And another reason is that you'd think that we ought to be able to understand that reduction is just one form of unification. Surely, after the recent history of chemistry, well, let's turn to the modern study of language during the past 60 years, sometimes called the generative enterprise. It's actually recapitulated a lot of this history without as much awareness as it should have had and should have today, in my opinion. So much as in the early days of the modern scientific revolution, the generative enterprise began with a willingness to be puzzled by what appear to be simple and obvious phenomena, like the examples I mentioned earlier. And it was very quickly discovered, just as in the early scientific revolution, that these are all over the place. And that's almost always the case if we allow ourselves to be puzzled by what seems to be simple and obvious. I think it's fair to say that step, that willingness to be puzzled, it's what opens the door to a serious inquiry that goes beyond the surface, just as it did in the early modern sciences. The generative enterprise also adopted Descartes' observations about the creative aspect of language use, at first without awareness, since the history of these matters had long been forgotten, and when even mentioned was just typically dismissed as old-fashioned mysticism without understanding it. Actually, even the scholarly literature is pretty scandalous, I have to say. The generative enterprise took as its primary task to discover the mechanisms that enter into this remarkable ability, creative aspect of language use, which does seem to be one crucial foundation for what distinguishes humans from other organisms. Notice that the discovery of the mechanisms, it's a very challenging scientific task in itself, but even if you discover them, which is a long way off, that would still leave us very far from understanding how they're put to use in a creative way. That's a question that's barely even on the horizons of inquiry. Well, thanks to discoveries in the formal sciences, logic and mathematics, that were just coming to be understood 60 years ago, it was possible for the first time to develop quite substantial proposals to show how the design of language might satisfy some fundamental conditions that trace back to classical antiquity, such as the fact that language somehow links sound with meaning, and in fact does so over an unbounded range. Again, a very obvious fact, which doesn't seem to have been recognized for centuries. In fact, until the early modern scientific revolution, I can't find any reference to it, primarily by Descartes, but also indirectly by Galileo shortly before him. This means that every language consists of a finite, it's in the brain, a finite computational system that yields an infinite array of structured expressions, each of which provides instructions for other organic systems. The sensory motor system for externalization as sound or sign or some other modality, and the systems of thought, interpretation, planning, and the like. Well, by now a fair amount's been learned about how such systems are constituted and how they function, and most important, about the limited range of options that the mind makes available, and even sometimes why there are such limits. These are results that, I won't go into it, that provide some solutions to puzzles of the kind that I mentioned at the outset, which again are all over the place. Well, there are many further tasks. One is unification with the brain sciences. That might turn out to be reduction, although very few people should be surprised if the course turns out to be rather like chemistry. It's worth bearing in mind that physics a century ago was way more advanced than the brain sciences are today, and yet it had to be radically modified before it could be unified with chemistry. Now, there's quite important work underway in neurolinguistics. It's a difficult, promising field, but I think that few doubt that unification is a pretty remote prospect. Well, still another task is to inquire into how the language capacity might have evolved. Oddly, this is a very popular topic. There's a flow of books and articles pouring out regularly. And it is very odd, if you think about it, for many reasons. One reason is that far simpler questions are barely studied because they're understood to be much too difficult. For example, the evolution of the varied communication systems of hundreds of species of bees. A second reason why it's odd is that the methods of evolutionary biology are not available in the case of language. You can't do comparative work. Of course, you have no fossil record. That's been forcefully argued by prominent evolutionary biologists who are just ignored. Another, even more fundamentally reason why it's odd is that the evolution of some system, say, call it X, any system X, it can proceed only as far as you've told us what X is. Okay, so you can't study the evolution of the eye if you don't know what an eye is. That sounds kind of simple. But if you take a look at the numerous publications, the real libraries on evolution of language, they almost barely try to say what language is beyond the most superficial aspects. In fact, a careful look shows that with very rare exceptions, they're not even studying the evolution of language. They're studying the evolution of communication. The speculations about the evolution of communication, totally different matter, and though I won't pursue it here, I think there's good evidence that communication is a secondary aspect even of language use and not a significant factor in language design. Well, despite these problems, I think there's at least something to say about these matters, and we can hope that in the future there will be more if the topic is seriously pursued. Well, another topic, in this case very actively and productively pursued, particularly in the past few decades, is acquisition of language. How does a child acquire its language? It's actually quite a remarkable feat. There's a lot to be puzzled about there too, only barely beginning to be investigated. Even the very first stage is remarkable. So think of a newborn infant. It's immersed in what William James famously called a blooming, buzzing confusion, just a mass of unorganized data. Somehow, the newborn infant manages to extract out of this confusion data that bear on language, of course, reflexively and almost instantaneously. In fact, in part prenatally, we now know. How that's done is largely unknown, and it's only very recently even become a topic of study. It seems pretty clear that it's not a property of the human auditory system. And one reason is that other sensory modalities seem to work just as well. Another reason is that it's recently been discovered that higher apes appear to have essentially the same auditory system as humans, even attuned to the same phonetic features that enter into human sound systems. But they don't detect anything about language, of course. So there must be some form of internal computational processing involved from the very first instant. And the course of growth and development from that point on also are quite remarkable when studied closely, as has been done in recent years for the first time. Okay, well, I'll have to stop at that point. It should be obvious that this is only the bare sketch of some of the prospects for the study of language, mind, and body as they're reconstituted. If we pay some attention to what has been discovered in recent centuries, and if we pursue John Locke's modest ambition, quote him, to be employed as an under-laborer in clearing the ground a little and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way to knowledge. Thanks.
I was just going to get, do you want to just stay here? We'll have people line up for questions, and we'll take it for about a half hour.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to take questions for a half hour. I think there are two microphones here. If someone wants to ask a question, please line up, and I'll call on you to please speak clearly into the microphone so everyone can hear. Okay? Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, can everyone hear me?
I'm not going anywhere.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So, as I understand it, you were talking about Locke's modest proposal to, as I understand it, answer the hows of life and not necessarily the whys. So, you know, that's kind of a departure from what a lot of us think of that science can really do for us. You know, tell us everything. And I think what you've discussed kind of shows us that we can't know everything from it. So I'd like to, you know, ask what you personally take from the study of science. What is it really worth to you, and why do you do it?
Well, first of all, you're quite right. It's very commonly believed that we can, in principle, understand everything. I can give you references if you like, but it's a very standard thesis in the sciences and in philosophy of science by leading people. And it's a very strange thesis because it was understood centuries ago that it can't be true. The people who make these statements also worship David Hume as one of the kind of founders of modern thought. But he very clearly pointed out, as I quoted, that while Newton did remove some of the mysteries of nature, he left other mysteries in a state where they will always remain mysterious to us, and he had reasons for it. Often it's argued that on evolutionary grounds, we have simply evolved so that we can answer every possible question. That's part of, you know, natural selection, selected us to answer questions. I mean, that goes back a long time. Charles Sanders Peirce argued that, and all the way to the present, but it's totally crazy. I mean, hunter-gatherers did not evolve to solve problems of mechanics, you know, or let alone quantum theory. So there's just nothing to that. And that's what we're stuck with. There are things we can understand. There are limits to understanding. And we might even, in principle, discover what the limits are. I mean, it's not contradictory. It's hard, but it's not contradictory to think that inquiry into the nature of human intelligence might explain why it can deal with some things and not deal with other things. Like to take a crude and oversimplified, but maybe not false example, humans can deal with determinacy. You know, a lot of science deals with determinacy. Can deal with randomness. A lot of work on randomness. But maybe there are things that don't fall within randomness and determinacy. Like, for example, the creative aspect of language use, which doesn't seem to be determined by circumstances, and obviously isn't random, but is appropriate to circumstances and is understood to be. And what that gap is pretty obscure. We recognize it all the time, you know, but it doesn't mean we can understand it. Maybe it falls beyond the bounds of human science. It's possible. But and incidentally, this extends to choice generally, not just to, that's dramatic in the case of language. That was Descartes' point. But so what's the point of science? To understand as much as you can. We want to understand as much as we can about the nature of things. That seems a worthy objective.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh.
Hi, Mr. Chomsky. What a pleasure. So I know a few languages, and one of them is American Sign Language. And you were talking about infants, and it's been shown that even before they can develop the ability to speak, they can actually learn to sign and understand quite a few signs. So I'm wondering, how does sign language factor into this? When you study languages, and so when you're fluent in a language, I find that when I don't think, I can sign more fluently than when I actually try to think and formulate what I'm trying to say. So how does that factor into it?
Well, I'll go back with another personal reflection, since I was asked to do that. Where this stuff all began about 60 years ago, it was actually 3 students at Harvard, 3 grad students, who didn't believe anything that was going on, and started trying to think about alternatives. One was Eric Lenneberg, who went on to found Biology of Language. We were all friends. Eric started studying he was interested in the language of the linguistic achievements of kids who were deaf and blind. So he went to the Perkins School of the Blind, famous school in Boston, where they teach deaf children language. At that time, and for long afterwards, even still today often, there was a very strict oralist tradition. Children who were deaf had to learn to lip read. They were not allowed to learn sign. And the logic was that if they learned sign, they wouldn't be able to integrate into the general community. So the teacher would, be drilling the kids in lip reading. And Eric noticed that as soon as the teacher turned to the board, the kids would start going like this. They'd obviously invented a sign language and were communicating with each other in sign. But when the teacher wasn't looking, you're familiar with that phenomenon. But it was kind of left hanging for a long time. But in the last, since about the 1980s, there's been serious study of it. And it's been discovered that a sign language is just another language. So, for example, at my department at MIT, there's a course on what's called exotic languages, meaning anything but Indo-European languages. And it's kind of meant in quotes. And a couple of years ago, they just used sign language. It's just another language. The acquisition is very similar to spoken language. To the extent that the neural aspects are understood, it seems to be the same, which was a big surprise. It was assumed by most people that signing would be mostly be registered in the right hemisphere because it's visual. But it turns out it's in the left hemisphere, same place as spoken language. So there's some kind of analytic system in there somewhere that doesn't care what modality it comes in. And some of the things are pretty amazing, but by now it's just another language. So there's nothing more to say.
Over here.
Yeah.
Hi.
Incidentally, there are many sign languages. Yeah, quite a lot. It's not just one language. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the talk. So one question I had was, you talked very briefly at the end about sort of the difference between the general study of communication and just language. And so for those processes that you would associate with actual true language, how separable would you consider those from just the general cognitive machinery that goes behind the way that we interpret the world?
Cognitive machinery?
Yeah, the overall sort of cognitive framework. If you had some machine, say, that was able to produce models of sensory data and try to communicate them, would you expect some sort of, are there certain inevitabilities to the language process in terms of useful transmission of information, or is it hard to say?
It's like saying, why do we assume that there's anything special about the visual system? I mean, suppose the mammalian visual system. I mean, after all, if we had some computational mechanism that was able to construct models based on data in the world, why shouldn't it behave like the mammalian visual system? Of course, the insect visual system doesn't, you know. And it's kind of the same with language. I mean, it's, incidentally, what you're saying is a very common belief. Again, like in the cognitive sciences, I wouldn't say it's an orthodoxy, but it's very commonly believed that there can't be anything special about language. It's just a collection of an array of cognitive processes. You go back about 60 years and the same view was held. Language is just a set of behaviors, like all other behaviors. At that time it would be by, you know, developed by conditioned response and so on. And now it's by whatever cognitive processes are around. Well, you know, it's conceivable, just like it's conceivable for the visual system. It's kind of interesting that it's not entertained for the visual system. And the reasons for not entertaining it are at least as strong in the case of the language system. I mean, if it's just a set of cognitive processes, why doesn't an ape do it? You know, they have cognitive processes. It's not the input system, because they have pretty much the same input system. For a long time it was thought that it's because they don't have an articulatory system. But the work on sign shows that that can't be right. The apes can sign. They just can't do anything with that data. They're not designed for it. Just as we can't carry out the kind of navigation that an ant can. We're not designed for it. So yes, you can. I mean, the thesis is common. As far as I know, it has no evidence for it, and it's highly unlikely. Unless you believe what Louis Racine said, that apes can really do it, but they're smart enough not to because they know we'll enslave them. I can't think of any other argument. So, but yes, it's common. But there's not much point proposing. It's common in the cognitive sciences, and my view is it ought to be eliminated. I mean, if you can show how some capacity can be developed by general mechanisms, great, we'll all be excited. But just to say, well, maybe they can, I don't see any point in that in any aspect of biology.
Thank you.
Over there now. Hi, Mr. Chomsky. I'd like to touch on just kind of going back to what he said about the difference between communication and the study of language, and how you think, because as I understand it, some neurologists believe that a lot of emotional communication comes from kind of a musical expression in the right brain, while more data-based communication comes from language in the left brain. How do you think your concept of language explains how language can express emotion in communication?
Well, you know, it's another dogma that language and communication are about the same thing. But if you think about it, it's extremely implausible. For one thing, almost any behavior you carry out communicates something. A gesture, a hairstyle, you know, almost anything. So sure, language behavior also communicates something. First of all, beyond that, almost all language is not involved in communication. And we all know that. I mean, you can't go 1 minute without talking to yourself. I mean, it takes a tremendous effort of will not to be doing whatever you're doing when what's going on in your head. Well, that's plainly not communication. You're doing it yourself. That's about 99.9% of the use of language. Now, in fact, when you really think, it's never been investigated, but if you introspect about it, it could be investigated seriously, you know, from kind of third-person point of view, but hasn't been. So you can only sort of think about it yourself. But I can only tell you my introspections. You can figure out yours. But my introspections are that when I am thinking in language, it's not really language. There's just like an occasional word will flit along, and I know what I want to say, and then I can express it somehow, sometimes, either internally or externally. But if it's the same for you, then that suggests that there's some kind of language use going on in there that isn't even using the articulated language system. And it's just kind of hovering in there somewhere. Occasionally bits and pieces come out, and if you try, you can say them to yourself or say them outside. and you know when you get it right, which means that you must have meant something, and the articulation that you produce can match what you meant. But what you meant is in some internal language. And furthermore, even if you look at the part of language, very small part, that's external, like what we're doing, a very small part of that is communication in a serious sense. I mean, a lot of it is just setting up social relations, telling jokes to your friends, passing time. I mean, it's not communication in a meaningful sense of the word communication. So I think it's just a big mistake to identify communication with language.
First, I want to say thank you for coming here, Dr. Chomsky. It's an honor to have you. You talked a lot about the limits of our understanding, and I was curious about, do you believe the connection is between our limits of understanding and as far as human happiness goes? Specifically, do you feel that it's antithetical, the more that we understand, to us to be happy, like on an existential level? Is hedonism not compatible with us being comfortable with our existence? I mean, is hedonism necessary rather than interrogating nature as far as it can possibly go?
Well, I think these are really important issues that have to do a lot with our lives and the way we act, but they're way beyond the bounds of scientific inquiry. We can reflect about them, think about them, maybe clarify some of the ideas that are involved in them, but it's just, science can deal with simple things. It doesn't get anywhere when you get to more complex things. It's hard, It's even hard to deal with simple things and try to explain them. And when you do, you find all sorts of surprises. Like, for example, you find that our only intelligible concept of the world is wrong.
Yes, returning to the issue of language and communication, it seems, to me anyway, less likely that the statement you made would be true, that 99% of language is in fact not communication. And that might be the case today, but I would see that more as kind of a social byproduct, that maybe we have more time for introspection. We live in a society where speaking is, I guess, less common, less necessary. But it seems, however, that language would have developed specifically as a means of communication, and that earlier humans in whom language was developing would have spent more time speaking to each other, because it seems like that would be the most instant form of interaction and entertainment, and there'd just be less time for introspection. So I just wanted to see how you would feel about that.
We have hunter-gatherer tribes. As far as we know, they're just like us. Remember, language hasn't evolved at all for 50,000 years since humans left Africa. A small group left Africa, spread all over the world, and we're all basically identical. If you take an infant from an Amazonian tribe that hasn't had other human contact for 20,000 years and bring it up in Baltimore, it'll speak straight Baltimore English, end up here studying physics, and conversely. So there doesn't seem to be, there are individual differences among humans, but there don't seem any significant or almost detectable group differences. So nothing's happened for about 50,000 years. And if you go back about 50,000 years before that, there isn't really any evidence that there was language. I mean, in that, of course, we're beyond, as I said, you don't have comparative evidence, you don't have fossil evidence, but you do have artifacts. And in fact, there was a big kind of creative explosion that took place somewhere in that window, let's say maybe 75,000 years ago, a sudden explosion of symbolic representation, complex social structures, observations, apparent observations of astronomical events, all kinds of things just suddenly happened. In general, it's usually assumed, we don't have direct evidence, that this must have been connected with this sudden emergence of language. And notice that it's very sudden. in evolutionary times. Now, you can double or triple the numbers. It's still a flick of an eyelash in evolutionary time. So somewhere in a very small window, something happened, and then nothing happened afterwards. That part we're pretty sure of. Well, what would have happened? Whatever happened, unless there's some mechanism that biology hasn't discovered yet, whatever happened would be some rewiring of the brain, some mutation that caused a rewiring of the brain. And that rewiring of the brain would have given this mechanism, this computational mechanism that allows these things to happen. But a rewiring of the brain, a mutation takes place in an individual, not in a group. Okay, that's obvious. So this happened to somebody, you know, some person in some small hunter-gatherer group underwent this change. That person had the capacity to do what we all do internally, but without the externalization, because there was nobody to talk to. You know? So there's no reason to think it was externalized at all. It's just that whatever is going on in our heads that is pre-linguistic, that we get bits and pieces of it when we think about, that would have been available for one person. Well, you know, if there's any selective advantage to that, say ability to plan and so on, it could have been, it could proliferate in a small group there over generations. There could be enough people who had that, so it would make some sense to interact. But then at that point you would get externalization. But externalization is a very tough process. There's this internal thing in the head which developed without any external pressures, okay, because there were no selectional pressures on it, almost by definition. So it's kind of like a snowflake, you know, something that just develops because that's the way nature works. You have this thing in the head, you have a sensory motor system which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years and has nothing to do with it, and you have to match them up. That's a complicated process. In fact, that's where practically, as far as we know, that's where almost all the complexity of language is. When you learn a language, that's what you learn. A child who's acquiring a language, that's what they acquire. Nobody teaches you, you don't learn the kinds of things I mentioned at the beginning, which are probably just part of the way the snowflake works. So it was, and then of course once you have the externalization, you could have some kind of communication. So, you know, even from the minimal evolutionary speculation, and of course it's all speculation, it looks like a plausible scenario. It incidentally has looked that way to some of the leading evolutionary biologists too. It's hard to think of an alternative, in fact. So yeah, it does kind of sound intuitive that people ought to be communicating all the time. What else do they need language for? But like a lot of obvious things, when you look at it, it just doesn't seem to be true.
I don't want to have to do this, but I think we're going to take 2 more questions because we're running up against time constraints in this room. So 1 and 2, and I'm sorry to disappoint the rest of you, but that's the way life is. Okay, 1.
Again, I wanted to thank you for coming today. It was very informative. I had another question about when you were talking about the limits of the human mind. I study environmental science here, and outside of any of my science courses, one thing I've kind of taken from that is that there's, to me, I don't really believe in a limit to what we can do to become a more sustainable people of humanity. So to me, I really don't see a limit in the actions that we can take towards that. And I've kind of applied that to other things in life that really, as humans, we don't have a limit in what we can do. So when you said that there might be some sort of limit to the human mind, my first thought was, I don't like that, I didn't agree. But as I thought about it more, I thought it was an incredibly good point. And I started to think more about, like, if the actions we take are necessarily completely limited by what our mind can do. And basically what I'm trying to ask is, if there is a limit to that the human mind can do and can comprehend, does that limit human action, both for right now and in the future?
Well, we're assuming no evolution, you know, that we say this organism not some other organism. And the time scale of evolution is too long to worry about. We'll have destroyed ourselves before that. So assume that we stay this organism. We know perfectly well there are limits to what we can do physically, like we can't fly like eagles, say. Okay, and if there are also limits to our cognitive capacities, that really shouldn't surprise anyone. It would just say we're biological organisms, not angels. Furthermore, instead of being unhappy about it, you should be happy about it. Because if we weren't constrained, suppose there were no constraints on intelligence, it would be as if there were no constraints on physical growth. If there were no constraints on the way a fetus could develop, you couldn't get any organization or structure. You get some kind of amoeboid creature that couldn't survive or do anything. And it's exactly the same with cognitive capacities. If there were no constraints, you couldn't learn anything, couldn't acquire anything, you couldn't discover anything. You'd just be flailing around randomly. So we ought to be very happy that there are constraints, because there's kind of a logical connection between scope and limits. If you don't have limits, you also don't have any scope. You can't, same with physical growth. It's because the fact that there are certain limits on what you can be enables you to become what you did become. If there weren't any limits, a germ cell could grow anyway. You'd be anything, nothing.
Last question.
Hi, Dr. Chomsky. Thanks. I'm a English as a second language teacher, and I was wondering what you think about this pertaining to second language acquisition, like language versus communication. And with your first language, it's really easy to know when a person knows it. It seems like one of those obvious and simple things. But when would you say somebody knows a second or third language? I mean, is it when they can communicate, or can they say ungrammatical things that a native speaker wouldn't say, and they still know a language?
Well, first of all, it's very hard to know what, say, a child knows in his first language. It's very hard to discover. I mean, it turns out that kids know a great deal beyond anything they're exhibiting. That's been shown over the years of study of child language acquisition. And we don't know exactly how much it is, but certainly an infant knows far more than anything it's exhibiting. You can show that by careful experimentation. Lila Gleitman and Penn, other people have done this. And there's even some evidence. It's not very powerful, and you can't really investigate it any further, but there's some evidence that by the age of about maybe 18 or 20 months, a child may know virtually the whole language. The reason for believing that is cases of the Helen Keller type. Helen Keller got perfect fluency, extremely fluent. She lost sight and hearing at about 20 months. And she invented for herself, we now know, this is a recent discovery from old pictures and videotapes, she had discovered for herself a method of teaching the deaf-blind that was later invented and used for teaching the deaf-blind. It's called Tadoma. It's a system where the person puts their hand on somebody's face like this, and the fingers feel the motions of the facial musculature, and the thumb feels the vocal cord. I mean, that's a minuscule amount of information, but it's enough to acquire, in Helen Keller's case, essentially perfect fluency. Well, that's been studied a little now, systematically, and there aren't a lot. There's some interesting results have come out which haven't been published because there aren't enough cases. Actually, my wife did the main work on this at MIT. They found that there are cases of very great success for people who lost sight and hearing roughly about Helen Keller's age, but not at about, say if it was 16 months when they lost it, they get no recovery. Now, there aren't a lot of cases, so you can't be sure. And fortunately, there aren't going to be any more cases. This was all spinal meningitis, which is now curable. But that's what it looks like. There may be more indirect ways to investigate it, but it's at least suggestive that children, very young children, have a tremendous capacity, and there's experimental evidence for it. So I wouldn't say that in the case of first language learners, we know what they know. We don't. It's hard, like most of these things. In the case of second language learners, I think there's a practical question that concerns you. What are you trying to achieve in second language acquisition? If your goal is get them to be able to communicate, well, of course, you'll test ability to communicate.
Thank you very much.